So now I want to begin a series. I'm not sure how long this will go. It may only be 3 parts on Cormac McCarthy's 5th novel, Blood Meridian, or The Evening Redness in the West, as he subtitles it, which came out in 1985. And as I say, it's his 5th novel, but it marks a watershed in McCarthy's oeuvre. Up to this point, he had written 5 novels and 1 screenplay, and those novels were his, and I've already gone over them, the first 3 of them, the Appalachian trilogy, as I call it, with The Orchard Keeper, which had come out in 1965, I believe it was, which was followed by Outer Dark, as we have seen, in 68, if I remember, and then Child of God, which was the 3rd of those. And then in 1975, he wrote a screenplay called The Gardener's Son, which was filmed, actually, it was the first thing of his to be filmed as a 16 millimeter film, a 2-hour 16 millimeter film, and then Suttree, which came out in 79. And then that was it for his Southern period. And it is clear from this period, which I regard as McCarthy's modernist period. In a way, he begins as a kind of atavistic modernist, even though he is within the epoch of postmodernity, which is everything that comes after World War II. Nonetheless, he's still writing in a style that is very consciously imitative of William Faulkner and of the Southern grotesque and its themes. And he is very much concerned with, as I would put it, fighting the Civil War by other means, because these novels, and especially the screenplay, The Gardener's Son, are concerned with documenting the effects, the degenerating effects of industrialization on the wiping out of primitive ways of life. We had seen in The Orchard Keeper how modernization was seen to uproot and displace Arthur Ownby from his orchard, where he was sort of symbolically Adam tending the garden. But that's also connected with the agrarian way of life, and we had seen how in the prologue there, McCarthy had inserted a couple of paragraphs on a tree into which an iron fence or the tree had grown into the fence, and it had killed the tree, and a work crew was trying to extract the tree from the fence, which was of course a symbol of industrialization, killing off the green world, the agrarian world of the South. And especially as we get down to the screenplay The Gardener's Son, which is very consciously a kind of late decaying echo of the South against the North, when we have the scenario of a factory owner named, I've forgotten the factory owner's name, but the gardener's son is McAvoy, Robert McAvoy, and he has had an accident in this factory, which is a textile mill in the South, in South Carolina, that has been run very well by the owner for many years, who has allowed the gardener, namely Robert McAvoy's father, Patrick McAvoy, to keep a garden with a greenhouse going. But when he dies and it's turned over to his son, James, he's a very corrupt individual, and he does not treat his workers fairly at all. And Robert, meanwhile, has had to have his leg amputated as a result of the accident. And he has also heard that this individual, James, has tried to seduce his sister, actually offered her money for sex, which she turned down and then left his office scared to death. I think she was only 14 at the time. And so McAvoy has it in for this guy, and he goes into the factory one day and murders him, shoots him with a gun several times and murders him. And then the play ends with McAvoy having to be hanged, of course, for the crime. But once again, this is the Civil War fought by other means. And in this respect, the shift from McCarthy as a Southern writer to providing the Southwest, I think, with its first truly great writer, is an interesting shift in a concern with the sort of 2 different boundary zones. One, the Mason-Dixon line, which forms the boundary zone between the North and the South, and which was laid between 1763 and 1767 by Jeremiah Dixon and Charles Mason to resolve the dispute between Pennsylvania and Maryland. But then it turns out that it became a very accurate line, which was worked out astronomically for the division, not in terms of the border with Mexico, forming a division regarding an external proletariat, but this is an internal proletariat. As the South secedes or attempts to secede from the Union with the Confederates and the Confederate Union, and we get the attempt of the secession of an internal proletariat along this Mason-Dixon line. And so it is interesting, I think, that McCarthy shifts from concerns with this internal boundary zone that is internal to the United States to then relocating to the Southwest. Specifically, he moved from Tennessee to Santa Fe. And his character of the kid here traces his arc. The kid, who's not given a name, comes from Tennessee also and migrates to Texas. It is a shift from one boundary zone to another. The Mexican-American War had been fought between 1846 and 1848 over this issue of settling the southern boundary of the United States. Basically, the war resulted in the complete annexation of almost the entire Southwest to the United States, and settling this border of what would decide what would be an external proletariat to the United States versus what was on the within, what's called the zone of cooperation by Heiner Mühlmann. Whereas these two terms, internal proletariat and external proletariat, come to us from Arnold Toynbee, who defines an external proletariat as those who are other, beyond the pale, those who are beyond the Roman limes, let's say, or the Great Wall of China, the barbarian Xiongnu, who are beyond the pale. That's the external proletariat, whereas an internal proletariat is a group that is within a society but is no longer of it because it has become disaffected with the dominant minority. The creative minority has degenerated into a dominant minority and can no longer lead through mimesis, through inspiration, but by force. And so the South, with the Civil War, we have the secession of the attempt anyway of a secession of an internal proletariat from the body social. But here you have, before that, with the Mexican-American War, the working out of the southern boundary, which at the time of the setting of the novel, which is about 1849, 1850, still the border has not fully been worked out and won't be until the Gadsden Purchase of 1853, which resolves it once and for all. I think the border in Arizona had been along the Gila River after the Mexican-American War, and then after the Gadsden Purchase, it was extended to include Tucson, Yuma at one end, Bisbee at the other, and down to Nogales. And so that settled the border once and for all. So this novel is set during the period of the working out of this southernmost border of the United States, which defines the zone of cooperation from within against the zone of maximal stress, or the external proletariat that is on the other side of that wall, and that boundary which has been more or less stable ever since then. We have for the Mason-Dixon line, of course, we've got Thomas Pynchon's great novel Mason and Dixon, where he recounts the exploits of Jeremiah Dixon and Charles Mason working out that what becomes an internal schism to the United States, which is never really 100% healed, which is revealed by the fact of McCarthy as a Southerner still being very much concerned with the ways in which modernity and industrialization has degraded modern life. So that's the setting, and so we begin. Blood Meridian, as John Sepich remarks in his very excellent commentary, notes on Blood Meridian, the book can be divided, though it is not. McCarthy, by this novel, has eschewed whereas the previous three novels had been divided into separate parts. This one isn't, but it's divided. It has 23 chapters plus an epilogue, but the first 5 chapters can be regarded as one unit in which we have the kid. We follow his birth, his migration from Tennessee to Texas, and his exploits when he joins a rogue band pretending to be affiliated with the U.S. Army, but which is actually a filibustering band of rogues who descend into Chihuahua on the way to Sonora for spoils. Basically, they're just looking for spoils. They think they have the excuse to do so even though the war is over. And this is in 1849, and it's completely illegal. They don't have any legal authority to do this. The kid joins up with them, and then it ends with their disastrous wiping out by Comanches, wiping them out, massacring all but 8 of them, a party of 46, by hundreds of Comanche in the Chihuahuan desert there. And then the second section goes from 6 to 16, which details the kid's exploits with the Glanton gang, who are scalp hunters hired now by the Mexican government to go and get scalps to collect them to protect the Mexicans against the raids of the Apache and the Comanche. And then finally the last section, which picks up with section 17 and continues on toward the end of the novel. So in this video I just want to discuss these first 5 chapters. So as it begins, the kid, as he's named, and it's interesting that he doesn't have a name. I had pointed out that in McCarthy's second novel, Outer Dark, most of the characters in that novel do not have names, with the exception of a few, but primarily the brother-sister pair there, Cullahome, whom the kid here actually reminds me of, and his sister Rinthy Home. They have names, but most of the characters don't, and there's a reason for that in that novel, insofar as the novel is McCarthy's version of hell as a place where nothing has any meaning. There are no names, there are no vectors. It's a place without names. And so I think that the kid is almost the only character in this who doesn't have a name. He's a sort of vestigial holdover from that world. And he reminds me a bit of the character Cullahome in that novel. And so we trace his birth in 1833. On the first page here, McCarthy says that he's born during a Leonid meteor shower in 1833, which Sepich says would have occurred in November of that year, most likely around November 12th, which would make him a Scorpio astrologically. And Scorpio is ruled by Mars, the planet of war, of course, and the kid is prone toward, as he says here, loving violence, a taste for mindless violence, as it says right in the third paragraph here. So then he migrates eventually through Galveston to Nacogdoches. And in the first chapter here, in Nacogdoches, he finds himself in a tent revival meeting held by a preacher, a man named Reverend Green, whom Sepich says was a real character. And a lot of these characters are real. Actually, Judge Holden, as it turns out, is based on an actual historical character, as hard as that may be to believe, but he is. So is Reverend Green and a few other of these characters. So what McCarthy has done here, not only do we have the shift from the south to the southwest, and the shift from McCarthy's modernist period to, I think, the birth of his postmodern period. Blood Meridian is unquestionably a novel of postmodernity, one of the characteristics of which is to, as it was the case in New York with pop art, is to elevate pop art forms to the level of high art. And prior to this, I don't think we can say that there had ever been a Western, and Larry McMurtry doesn't count. Larry McMurtry is pulp fiction. It's what would be regarded as middle brow, between, let's say, dime store novels and the highbrow level of a McCarthy or a Pynchon. It's middle brow, so don't, those aren't great novels. Lonesome Dove is trash. I've read it, so it's trash. This is the first novel to elevate a lowbrow cowboy genre to the level of high art, which is a characteristic of postmodernity. And another main characteristic that this novel has is the intertwining of historical reality with things that McCarthy makes up as he goes along, so that it becomes very difficult, and even difficult for critics and commentators, to disentangle what is real and what has been made up here. You have the same problem with Thomas Pynchon in all of his novels, especially in Gravity's Rainbow. Did he make up the Schwarzkommando or what? Of course he did, but those are postmodern characteristics. So now McCarthy has shifted into his postmodern phase here with this elevation of this genre through all of his cowboy novels, going all the way down through the Border Trilogy and down to No Country for Old Men. They all become concerned with this southernmost boundary and the boundary acts that go along with defending that boundary, and the incursion of the external proletariat into the zone of cooperation represented by the United States. And so he finds himself in this tent, and this preacher, Reverend Green, who's giving a sermon which reminds one a bit of the sermon that is given at the beginning of Moby Dick by the preacher there, who's giving a sermon on the book of Jonah, naturally, of course. Although Reverend Green does not have very much luck with his sermon, as we first meet the judge, Judge Holden, who is a character who, Sepich points out, is based... So what Sepich did was to go back and read all of McCarthy's sources, all these original books, like Samuel Chamberlain's autobiography of his account as a member of the Glanton gang for a while. And then he contacted McCarthy and asked him if these were the right sources and so forth, and McCarthy said, yes, they're correct. So Judge Holden is mentioned as Judge Holden in Chamberlain's account and in a couple of other accounts, as an individual who was indeed almost 7 feet tall, 6'6", apparently, had no facial hair. I think McCarthy adds the innovation of making him completely bald and hairless, and was extremely well educated, as we find out here when we encounter the judge later on in his various sermons that he gives on nature as the word of God, for instance. He's extremely well educated, tall, and just not somebody you really want to trifle with, this guy. So he comes into the tent, notice, and disrupts this guy's sermon. He walks right around to the front of the crowd, standing between the crowd in the tent and the preacher, and says, this man is guilty of child molestation. you may not know this, but I happen to know that they found this child who had been violated. He's also guilty of goat fucking, as far as we know. And everybody gets riled up, and he starts this huge feud, and they go after the Reverend, and he leaves the tent. The kid leaves the tent with another guy, and they go into the bar that's nearby. And then in the bar, the judge is there at the counter with his hat off, and the kid is with the teamster, and I think the kid at this point is 16 years old, if I'm not mistaken. And he sees the judge there, and he overhears the judge telling another guy. The guy says, "So when were you in Fort Smith?" And he says, "Oh, I was never in Fort Smith." And he's like, "So when did you encounter this Reverend?" He said, "Never heard of the guy until I walked in today." And everyone starts laughing, and they realize the joke that has been played by this guy out of pure maliciousness. This, by the way, is an echo of an Irish myth. Everything in McCarthy is mythical, whether consciously or not. He's just a born storyteller. Of Manannán mac Lir, the Irish sea god, after whom King Lear eventually is named, Lear, Manannán mac Lir. He's the Poseidon of the Celtic pantheon, and there's an account of him. He's also a trickster god who likes to upset people just for the sheer fun of it. He goes to a feast at Ballyshannon, and there he is also a musician, and he plays very beautifully, and everybody cries over this beautiful Orpheus-type music. And then the malicious side of him kicks in, and he plays the music of dissonance, which is so dissonant that it causes an uproar, and everyone at the feast then gets into a fight. They all start fighting, and he leaves with a smile on his face. Same scene. Then, too, there's another mythical scene here when, in the same chapter, when the kid encounters Toadvine, this character named Toadvine, whom he encounters who's in the way down a hallway, and he won't move out of his way, and the kid's not going to move out of his way, and the guy, Toadvine, has no ears, and he has symbols carved onto his forehead, I think an F and an H. There's three characters. It might be an H and a T and an F. And then they fight. They try to kill each other, and it doesn't work. They're both equally matched. And so they buddy up and decide to, and the kid decides to help him burn down the hotel. He has it in for a guy. Toadvine does, and sticks a lighted piece of something under the guy's door. The guy comes running out, the whole hotel burns down, and the two then part, and the kid leaves on his mule. And that is of course, an echo of the initial encounter in the Gilgamesh epic between Gilgamesh and Enkidu, who also meet in a city for the first time. One of them is the wild man, Gilgamesh, who has come in from, let's say, the prairie, the Mesopotamian desert, who has come in. Gilgamesh is the spoiled brat king who thinks he has the right to fuck everyone's newborn or newlywed bride on the night before the groom can. And Enkidu is incensed by this, and he goes to meet him. And when they encounter each other, it's in a doorway, and they won't get out of each other's way. So they have to fight it out, and we have a bar fight type scene. They can't best each other, and so they decide to become friends from that point on. We don't see Toadvine again until at the end of this part 1, and at the end of chapter 5, when Toadvine becomes the link to link the kid up with the Glanton gang, who is also historical. John Joel Glanton is also a historical character, just like Judge Holden. And we don't see Judge Holden again until that episode. But as he's leaving the town on the back of his mule, he has this old broken down mule because he can't afford a horse, he can't afford anything. The judge looks at him and gives him an icy smile, as though, we'll meet again, trust me. So then we have chapter 2, the main point of which is the kid is wandering now outside of Nacogdoches, and he comes to a village, and he goes into a bar, and he gets into a fight with the bartender, who is very rude to him. He offers to do some sweeping for the bartender in exchange for a drink. He does the sweeping, and the bartender tells him to just leave, get away. The kid doesn't take this too kindly, and hops over the bar, smashes the guy's skull in, breaks a bottle, jags out his eye, and then helps himself to a bottle of whiskey and then leaves. He didn't want to play fair, so this is the way it was done in the Old West when you didn't want to play fair. You worked it out with muscle. So he leaves, and but then in the next chapter, chapter 3, word has gotten out of his exploit amongst this mysterious rogue band pretending that it is affiliated with the U.S. Army. It is not. It's non-military. even though they call each other corporals and sergeants and captains. It's a private filibustering. Filibustering means not in the political sense on the floor of the Senate. It means that it's a private rogue army that launches an illegal campaign into foreign territory. And that's what these guys are planning to do. So he meets one of these guys and says, hey, the captain has heard word of what you did there, the way you handled yourself in the bar, and we think you should sign up for the army. And he convinces the kid to go in and sit down with the captain. His name is Captain White, which Sepich says is most likely not a historical character, but is modeled on William Walker, who is a character who led a filibustering expedition in 1853 into Sonora. This Walker guy was something else. So he formed a private army, and with the intention of going to the Baja Peninsula and conquering it, and he had some success there, and then going up the peninsula into Sonora, which is on the western side of Mexico, and going down into Sonora. The Gadsden Purchase had not been made, and it's not made till December of 1853, and this was one of the things that stimulated it to get done, because Gadsden realized that guys like this might go in, as happened with Texas, where Texas became its own independent republic as the result of Mexico inviting Anglo settlers to come in there and colonize the land to get the economy up and running. And then by 1836, they declare themselves independent of Mexico, and then 1845, they're a state. And then so there's disputed territory to the west between Mexico and Texas, but now Texas is a state, so it's between Mexico and the U.S., and they go to war over that. And also the fact that the U.S. knew very well that there was gold in California and silver in Arizona. So he went and tried, this Walker guy, also tried to annex Sonora and Baja together and try to make it, try to create a state, yet another state out of this private expedition, which failed. And then later he launched a similar colonizing expedition against Nicaragua. And so this is the type of guy that Captain White is based on. Another guy also, Sepich says, Henry Alexander Crabbe in 1858 launched a similar expedition into Sonora and met with the same fate that White meets with, the wiping out of his band and the decapitation of the captain and the putting of his head into a jar of vinegar. He meets the same fate. And so White seems to have been fused together in good postmodern fashion by McCarthy from these two campaigns, Crabbe's campaign in 1858 and Walker's campaign in 1853. But this is in 1849. This is set in 1849 with his interview with Captain White, who signs him up. They give him new boots and some new clothes. Notice that nobody's wearing any uniforms here. This is not the army. This is a rogue band who has decided to go into Sonora, but they're coming, whereas Walker came from the west. These guys are coming from the east, out of Texas, across the Rio Grande, into Chihuahua, trying to make their way toward Sonora. And there's 46 of them, and the kid has now signed up. And then we get to the great and magnificent chapter 4, one of the best things that McCarthy ever wrote in his entire career as a writer. Some of his most beautiful writing and poetic is in this chapter that recounts the band, the rogue filibustering expedition going through this desert in Chihuahua, and in very bedraggled fashion. And then finally they see a dust cloud in the distance, and they think it's a stampede of horses with some cattle, and maybe it's some cattle thieves, but the Indians are actually hiding. And this is, Sepich traces this to a text, a couple of different texts, which shows that the Indians, the Comanche, these are Comanches now coming in, and what they would do is they would tilt their bodies off to the sides of their horses, so that the side you saw them coming from looks like it's not mounted by a rider. And then at the last moment, they would sit up and shoot with their bows and arrows. And that's what all these Comanche do. They sit up at the last moment, and these guys realize they're in trouble. There's hundreds of Comanche, and they completely massacre almost everyone except for the kid and 7 others. I think 8 survived this expedition. And then in chapter 5, which is also very good, we get a character named Sproul, who has survived from this expedition, walking alongside with the kid through a town that has been completely massacred and wiped out, and it's still smoldering from these Comanche who have blown through it and pillaged and robbed it. They come across a tree hanging with dead babies who they're all hung by the necks. All kinds of wonderful, colorful images that McCarthy is very good with. And then Sproul dies from an arrow wound that gets sepsis. He dies, and then the kid is arrested by the Mexican authorities, and he's put in a jail in Chihuahua City. And it's in that jail that, in the last page of chapter 5 here, where he recognizes Toadvine. And so Gilgamesh and Enkidu are back together again. And so that's the first chunk, the first 5 chapters of Cormac McCarthy's wonderful Blood Meridian. And so next we'll see, I'm not sure how many videos I'm going to spend on the next 10 chapters. It may require 2 or 3, but we'll see how it goes as I read back through this. I think this is my 3rd reading of this book, and every time I read it, it's a better book, that's why it's called a classic, right? This is like the literary, the Western version of Apocalypse Now, but I would put it on the level with something like Moby Dick or Ulysses, Gravity's Rainbow. It belongs in that kind of company, and so we'll continue from there.